Ladies and gentlemen, you won't believe what I went through. The man's trembling voice echoed, his hand gently pressing against the side of his bandaged head. 10 years, 10 long years this thing grew on me, and I thought it was nothing. Welcome, dear viewers, I wish you a pleasant viewing. Today, you will hear a story that still shakes me to the core. For a decade I carried a lump on my head, dismissing it as something harmless, something that didn't need attention. At first, it was just the size of a coin, barely noticeable under my thinning hair. Friends joked about it, calling it a lucky bump, and I laughed it off. But slowly, silently, it began to change my life. Each year, it grew larger, harder, more painful. I ignored it. I told myself I didn't have the money or the time to deal with hospitals. My wife begged me to see a doctor. She would stand behind me when I looked into the mirror, her eyes clouded with fear, whispering that it wasn't normal. But I shrugged her off, convincing myself that if I didn't think about it, it would go away. The truth hit me when strangers began to notice. I remember sitting in a cafe, sipping tea, when a little boy pointed at me and asked his mother why that man's head looked so big. I froze. People's eyes started to linger too long, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Shame washed over me, but still, I hesitated to act. Finally, one morning, I woke up with a splitting headache so severe I could barely stand. My wife, her patience exhausted and her love stronger than my pride, forced me into the car and drove me to the hospital. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my head, feeling the weight of 10 years pressing down on me. Other patients stared in silence. A child cried when he saw me. I had become a spectacle. When the doctor entered the room and removed my cap, his eyes widened. He didn't hide his shock. "How long has this been growing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I muttered the truth, 10 years. He shook his head, ordered immediate scans, and left the room with a look that chilled me to the bone. Lying under the cold machines, I listened to the hums and beeps, staring at the ceiling tiles that all looked the same. I prayed silently. The technician avoided my gaze, her lips pressed tight as if she had seen something she couldn't explain. Hours later, the doctor returned with the results. He spoke slowly, carefully, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. He said surgery was necessary. Not tomorrow, not in a week, today. The operating room was blindingly bright. Nurses adjusted equipment, surgeons whispered to each other, and I lay there feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. As the anesthesia took hold, the last thing I saw was the surgeon's eyes, sharp, focused, and filled with something between fear and determination. When I woke, the world was blurry. I felt bandages tightly wrapped around my head, and 4-line tugging at my arm, and the faint sound of beeping machines. My wife sat beside me, her eyes red from crying, holding my hand as though she never wanted to let go. "You made it," she whispered. Later, I overheard the surgeons talking in hushed tones outside my room. One of them said he had never seen anything like it in his career. They had cut open the lump and found something so unusual, so deeply shocking, that even seasoned doctors froze. Nurses gasped, instruments clattered, the entire room had gone silent. What they discovered inside that growth wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was something that would haunt them long after the surgery ended. And there I was, lying in a recovery room, alive but terrified, waiting to hear the full truth of what had been pulled from my head. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital window, warming the pale walls and giving me the first sense of relief in what felt like forever. Yet the tension in the air was thick. I could feel it in the way the nurses walked into my room, gentle, cautious, their eyes flicking to the bandages on my head before quickly looking away. My wife barely slept. She sat by my bedside, holding my hand, squeezing it each time she thought I stirred. Eventually, the door opened, and the lead surgeon walked in. His expression was unreadable, that carefully trained masked doctors wear when they have to tell you something difficult. He pulled a chair beside my bed, leaned forward, and began to explain. His voice was calm, deliberate, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that makes you stop breathing just to listen. He told me that what they had removed wasn't a simple tumor. It wasn't just a lump of fat or tissue that had overgrown with time. Inside, they had found hardened layers, dense and fibrous, that seemed to have formed around foreign matter. I blinked, not understanding. He explained further, something, long ago, must have triggered my body to build a wall around it, protecting me in the only way it knew how. The growth was my body's desperate attempt to trap what didn't belong there. I asked him, my voice shaking, what exactly it was. He paused, rubbed his forehead, and admitted that the results were still being analyzed. But what they pulled out was unlike anything he had seen in his years as a surgeon. His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. My wife gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. That day passed slowly. Every beep of the monitor, every shuffle in the hallway seemed louder than usual. I drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by memories of the past 10 years. I remembered the countless nights I told myself, "It's nothing." I remembered my children avoiding questions about the lump when their friends pointed it out. I remembered the shame, the denial, the stubborn pride that kept me from walking into a hospital sooner. All of it crashed down on me like a storm. By evening, one of the younger doctors came in with photographs from the surgery. My stomach tightened as he laid them on the tray beside my bed. My wife turned pale, but I forced myself to look. The images showed the mass opened up, layer after layer of thick, yellowish tissue wrapped around a dark core. Even in those lifeless pictures, it looked menacing, unnatural. The doctor explained how carefully they had to cut through the hardened shell without causing more damage. I listened, horrified, barely able to process the fact that this grotesque thing had lived on my body for so long. That night, as the hospital settled into its usual silence, I found myself staring at the ceiling again. The floor hummed, the machines beeped softly, and my wife's breathing beside me reassured me that I wasn't alone. But inside I felt broken. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything, my health, my family, my life. All because I ignored the warning signs. The next morning, the surgeon returned with the lab results. He stood by my bed, hands clasped tightly, and explained that the core of the growth contained calcified fragments, something my body had encased for years. It could have been an old injury, a fragment of bone, or tissue that went rogue decades ago. The words blurred together, but the one thing I caught was this: if I had waited any longer, the pressure from the mass might have caused permanent brain damage. My wife broke down in tears, burying her face against my arm. I closed my eyes and let the truth sink in. I had carried death on my shoulders for 10 years, and by sheer luck, I was still here. But survival didn't come without a price. The days that followed were filled with endless questions, curious stares from staff, and doctors visiting my room just to hear the story firsthand. I became a case, something people whispered about in the hallways. Some called it a miracle, others called it negligence. I called it a second chance. I remember one evening, a young medical student nervously entered my room, holding a notepad. He asked if he could hear my story in my own words. He said cases like mine were rare, something that might be written into textbooks one day. I stared at him, still bandaged, still weak, and told him the truth. Don't wait 10 years to face your fears. Don't be like me. My words trembled, but they came from a place deeper than I knew existed. The days stretched into weeks, and my hospital room became a place of strange routine. Each morning, the nurses came in to change the bandages around my head. Their hands were steady, but their eyes betrayed curiosity and unease. They whispered to each other when they thought I wasn't listening, as if my case had become a legend in the ward. My wife never left my side. She brought me tea from home, rubbed my shoulders when the pain grew too much, and reminded me, over and over, that I was lucky to still be alive. One afternoon, the chief surgeon visited again, this time accompanied by a small group of doctors and medical students. They stood at the foot of my bed, notebooks in hand, eyes wide with fascination. The surgeon explained my case to them, describing the decade-long growth, the strange hardened layers, and the shocking discovery during the operation. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, lying there while they dissected my past mistakes into teaching points. It was humiliating, but also strangely powerful. My suffering had turned into a lesson for others. After they left, I asked my wife if I should feel ashamed or proud. She held my hand tightly and whispered, "Alive! You should feel alive!" Her words stayed with me. For the first time in years, I realized how much I had taken my life for granted. Nights were the hardest. The hospital grew quiet, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer. The beeping machines reminded me of how fragile I had become. I often thought about those 10 wasted years, how many birthdays I had sat through pretending the lump wasn't there, how many nights I had turned my head in bed, trying to ease the throbbing pain, convincing myself it was nothing. Denial had been my prison, and now I was paying for it. One particular night, I woke from a nightmare drenched in sweat. In the dream, the lump had grown so massive it covered my face, suffocating me, silencing my screams. I jolted awake, gasping for air, my wife rushing to my side. She wiped my forehead and whispered that it was over, that the nightmare was behind us. But deep down, I wondered if it truly was. The next morning, I received permission to walk for the first time. With the help of a nurse, I shuffled slowly down the hallway, my four-pole rattling beside me. Other patients stared, some nodding in sympathy, others whispering. I caught my reflection in a glass door, a man weakened, his head wrapped in thick white bandages, his eyes sunken but still burning with life. I barely recognized myself, yet I felt an odd surge of pride. I had endured something most people would never understand. During those walks, I began speaking to other patients. A young man recovering from heart surgery told me he was afraid to go back to his job. An elderly woman whispered that she wished her children visited more often. I listened, and for the first time, I felt that my story had given me something new, a strange sense of purpose. People leaned in when I spoke. They wanted to hear what it was like to carry a monster on my head for 10 years, and to still wake up alive after the knife. One day, the surgeon finally sat me down for a longer conversation. He explained in detail what had happened during the operation. He said that when they cut into the mass, the room went silent. Inside, instead of a uniform tumor, they found a twisted, hardened shell protecting a calcified core. It was as if my body had been fighting a silent war all these years, walling off something it didn't trust. He admitted that many of the younger doctors froze, their eyes wide, unsure of what they were looking at. Nurses gasped, instruments trembled in their hands. For a few seconds, no one knew what to say. Hearing his words, I felt my chest tighten. I pictured the scene, the bright lights, the sterile instruments, the masked faces suddenly stricken with shock as they pulled out the mask that had been my silent companion for a decade. My wife squeezed my hand as I shuddered, realizing how close I had come to losing everything. And yet, in that sterile room, a miracle had occurred. I was still here. The recovery was slow, painful, but every day I took another step. Every day I breathed in and thanked fate for giving me a second chance. I promised myself I would never again ignore the whispers of my body, never again hide behind pride and fear. Because for 10 long years, I lived with a ticking time bomb on my head. And by some unexplainable mercy, I survived. Weeks passed, and the weight of everything I had been through began to settle deeper into my bones. The hospital had become a second home, with its constant hum of machines, the smell of antiseptic in the air, and the shuffle of nurses' shoes echoing down the corridors. My bandages were changed daily, and each time, I caught glimpses of the wound healing beneath. It was raw and ugly, but it was a reminder that I had survived. My wife remained my shadow, barely leaving my side. I often woke at night to find her sitting by the window, staring into the darkness, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. When I asked her what she was thinking, she would only shake her head and whisper, "I almost lost you." Her voice always broke on those words. I realized that my stubbornness, my refusal to face reality sooner, had put her through a decade of silent suffering. On one of my longer walks down the ward, I passed a group of medical students. I heard one of them whisper, "That's him." They looked at me the way people look at a figure from a story, half in awe, half in disbelief. It made me uncomfortable, Yet part of me understood why. My case had become more than just a surgery. It had become a living reminder of what happens when fear and denial win. Eventually, the surgeon returned with the final pathology report. He sat across from me, his hands folded, and explained in detail that the mass had been benign but dangerously complicated. The hardened layers were the body's way of isolating what it couldn't remove. Over time, the pressure it created could have damaged nerves, even impaired brain function. He looked me directly in the eyes and said, "You survived because you came when you did. If you had waited much longer, the outcome might have been different." Those words hit me harder than any scalpel could. My chest tightened as I thought of all the times I ignored the headaches, the dizziness, the subtle warnings. I thought of the countless excuses I made, the pride that blinded me, the way I had brushed off my wife's concerns. I wasn't just a man who had survived a strange medical condition. I was a man who had gambled recklessly with his life and nearly lost. My recovery continued slowly. Each day, I pushed myself a little further, walking longer distances, sitting upright for longer hours. The staff began to treat me less like a patient and more like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. They smiled when I walked past, sometimes stopping to ask how I felt. Even the head nurse confessed that she had followed my case closely, calling it one of the most unusual recoveries she had ever seen. But the moment that truly broke me came one evening, when my youngest son visited. He hadn't seen me since before the surgery. When he walked into the room and saw the bandages, he froze. His eyes filled with tears, and he rushed to my side, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Dad," he whispered, "I thought you were going to die." I held him as best I could, my throat tightening. In that moment, I realized that the true damage of my denial wasn't just physical, it was emotional. My children had grown up watching me carry a monster on my head, pretending it didn't exist. They had lived with fear because I refused to face my own. That night, after they left, I promised myself something. I promised that if I was given the strength to walk out of that hospital, I would never again hide from the truth. I would take every ache, every pain, every whisper of my body seriously. Because I had learned the hard way that silence can be deadly. As the days turned into months, I finally regained enough strength to leave the hospital. Walking through those doors into the fresh air felt like stepping into a new life. The world looked different. Colors seemed sharper, sounds clearer. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs, feeling the cool breeze on my face. My wife stood beside me, her arm hooked in mine, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't just walking out of a hospital, I was walking out of 10 years of denial, shame, and fear. And as we drove home, I glanced in the mirror at the bandages still wrapped around my head, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't see a burden. I saw survival. Returning home after so many weeks in the hospital felt surreal. The house looked the same, the creaky front gate, the faded curtains, the smell of old wood, but I felt like a stranger stepping into it. My wife had cleaned everything while I was away, as if she wanted me to return not to the place where I had suffered, but to a place reborn, free from the shadow of my illness. Yet no amount of cleaning could erase the years I had spent hiding from the truth. The first evening back, I sat in my old armchair near the window. The cushions sagged just as they always had, but sitting there with the weight of fresh bandages on my head made the chair feel different, like a throne of survival. My children hovered nearby, watching me closely, unsure if they could speak freely or if their words might break me. My daughter finally asked the question they all wanted to know. "Why didn't you go to the doctor sooner?" Her voice cracked, the innocence of her question piercing me deeper than any scalpel. I swallowed hard. How could I explain that pride, fear, and stubbornness had kept me silent for a decade? How could I admit that I had gambled not only with my life, but with their peace of mind? I looked at them and said softly, "Because I was foolish. And because I thought nothing bad could happen to me. I was wrong." The silence that followed was heavy, but necessary. They needed to hear me say it. They needed to see that I knew the truth now. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to routine, but nothing truly felt the same. Neighbors came by, some bringing food, others curiosity. They had all seen the lump growing year after year, but none of them ever said anything directly to me. They whispered, they speculated, but they stayed silent. Now, when they entered my home, their eyes widened at the sight of me alive, thinner, paler, but breathing. Some called it a miracle. Others shook their heads, saying I was lucky to even be standing. I agreed with them all. But the hardest part wasn't their looks or their questions. It was facing myself in the mirror. Each morning, when I washed my face, I caught sight of the scar running along my scalp, a long, crooked reminder of what had been removed. Some days I hated it. Some days I traced it gently with my fingers, whispering gratitude that it was there, because it meant I was alive. The scar became both my shame and my badge of survival. As time went on, I began to share my story more openly. Friends asked about it at gatherings, and instead of brushing it off with a joke as I once would have, I told them the truth. I described the years of ignoring it, the pain, the fear in the doctor's eyes, the silence in the operating room. I watched their faces change as they realized how close I had come to never telling the story at all. And every time I finished, someone would say, "I should really get this checked out," pointing to a mole, a cough, or a pain they had ignored for years. That became my purpose, to turn my decade of denial into a warning for others. But in quiet moments, when the house was still, I thought back to the surgery itself. I imagined the scalpel cutting into that hardened mass, the sudden hush that fell over the room, the gasps of nurses, the way the surgeons froze when they saw what lay inside. That image haunted me more than the lump ever had. It wasn't just what they found, it was their shock, their fear, that told me how close I had been to the edge. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange behind the rooftops, my wife sat beside me on the porch. She held my hand and said, "We wasted 10 years living with that thing. But maybe it saved us too. Maybe it taught us to never waste time again." I looked at her, at the lines of worry etched deep into her face. And I realized she was right. The lump had nearly destroyed me, but it had also stripped away the illusions I had built around myself. I was no longer the man who ignored problems, who pretended pain wasn't real. I had been given a second life, carved into me with scalpels and sealed with stitches. And I knew, as surely as I knew the scar on my head would never fade, that I could not waste this chance. The more time passed, the more I began to understand how deeply those 10 years had changed me. Life outside the hospital walls was supposed to be familiar, but it no longer felt the same. Every simple sound carried a new weight. The ticking of the kitchen clock reminded me of how many hours I had wasted ignoring my body's cries, and the laughter of children on the street reminded me of how many moments I nearly missed with my own family. The world hadn't changed, I had. At first, I struggled with recovery. My body was weak, my head still tender, and even the smallest task felt exhausting. I couldn't lift heavy objects, couldn't bend too quickly, and sometimes I felt dizzy just walking across the room. But the hardest challenge wasn't physical, it was psychological. Every time I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not just the scar but the ghost of the man I had been for 10 years, stubborn, prideful, blind to danger. That man was gone, and yet he haunted me, a reminder of how close I had come to throwing my life away. My wife, who had endured those years with quiet suffering, became both my anchor and my conscience. One evening, as she helped me change the bandages, she paused and said softly, "Do you know how many nights I lay awake listening to you groan in your sleep? Do you know how many times I thought I would wake up next to you and you'd be gone?" Her words pierced me more than any scalpel ever could. I realized then that my denial hadn't just been my burden, it had been hers as well. She had carried the fear I refused to acknowledge. The children were quieter around me in those first weeks, as though they were afraid to break me. My son, who once avoided looking at the lump, now stared at the scar as though trying to make sense of it. My daughter often reached out to touch my arm gently, as if to reassure herself that I was still real. I knew they were trying to heal too. I had forced them to live under the shadow of my negligence, and now we were all learning to live in the light again. Slowly, I regained strength. Walks around the neighborhood turn from 5 minutes into 20, then into full hours. Neighbors stop me on the street, some offering congratulations, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One old man tapped the side of his temple and said, "You got lucky, my friend. Not everyone walks out of something like that." His words followed me home, echoing in my mind. Lucky. Yes, that was what I was. But luck was fragile, and I knew I couldn't rely on it again. It wasn't long before word of my story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local journalist called, asking if I would be willing to share what had happened. At first I hesitated. Why expose myself again? Why reopen the wound? But then I thought about the people out there who might be ignoring their own warning signs, just as I had ignored mine. Maybe my story could jolt someone into action before it was too late. So I agreed. The article appeared a week later, with the headline, "Man lives 10 years with growing lump on his head, survives shocking operation." My photograph, scar and all, stared back at me from the page. At first, I felt embarrassed, as though my private shame had been pinned on a bulletin board for the world to see. But then the calls started coming in, friends, distant relatives, even strangers thanking me for sharing. One man told me he went straight to the hospital after reading my story because he had been ignoring a lump on his neck for years. That call alone made everything worth it. But fame of this kind was not easy to carry. Some people treated me like a miracle, while others mocked me for my foolishness. I overheard someone at the market whisper, "That's the man who let a tumor grow on his head for 10 years. Imagine being that careless." Those words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth behind them. I had been careless. I had been reckless. And yet here I was, alive. The scar on my head wasn't just a reminder of pain, it was also proof of survival. At night, lying beside my wife in the quiet of our home, I often replayed the scene of the surgery in my mind. The way the doctors froze, the silence that filled the room, the gasps of nurses as the mass was revealed. I imagined the tension, the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear, the bright lights reflecting off the surgical instruments as they cut deeper into what had defined my life for so long. That image would never leave me. It was carved into my memory as surely as the scar was carved into my skin. But in those same nights, when fear threatened to overwhelm me, I reminded myself of the lessons I had gained. I had learned humility. I had learned to listen to the quiet warnings of my body. Most of all, I had learned to cherish the people around me who had endured my stubbornness with love and patience. And so, each morning when I rose, I whispered the same words to myself. You survived. Don't waste it. Those words became my prayer, my ritual, my vow. Because survival, I realized, is not just about escaping death, it's about living differently afterward, with gratitude carved into every breath. Life after the hospital was both a gift and a trial. The scar on my head became the first thing people noticed, and while some tried to hide their stares, most couldn't help but look. At first, their glances burned me with shame, but over time, I realized that this mark was not just a reminder of my suffering, it was also proof that I had survived. That scar carried my story even when I said nothing. My wife stood by me through every step of recovery. She was stronger than I had ever given her credit for. I remember nights before the surgery when I brushed her fears aside, telling her not to worry, that the lump was nothing. Now, when I looked into her eyes, I saw the years of silent pain she had carried, the tears she had shed alone while I laughed off the danger. Sometimes I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if she still feared she might wake one morning to find me gone. I began to understand that my stubbornness had not only endangered me, it had imprisoned her in fear for a decade. The children slowly adjusted too. My son, once embarrassed by the stares of classmates, now walked beside me with a strange sense of pride, as though my survival made me stronger in his eyes. My daughter often asked about the hospital, wanting to know what it was like to be asleep while doctors worked to save me. I told her the truth, that I didn't remember much, but I remembered the fear before and the relief after. She would sit quietly, listening, and then reach out to trace the scar with her small fingers. It's like a battle scar, she whispered once. And maybe she was right. Neighbors brought food, offered prayers, and shared their own stories of health scares they had once ignored. Many admitted they hadn't dared to see a doctor until hearing what I went through. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a warning, a lesson whispered from one house to the next. Some called me reckless, others called me brave, but in truth, I was simply lucky. The nights, however, were harder. I often lay awake, replaying the scene that the surgeons had described, the silence in the operating room, the gasps of nurses, the way the doctors froze when they saw what was inside the lump. I imagined the scalpel slicing through years of hardened tissue, layer after layer, until the twisted mass revealed its dark core. That image haunted me. Sometimes I woke drenched in sweat, convinced I still felt the weight of it on my head. My wife would hold me until the panic faded, whispering, "It's gone. You're safe now." But the fear lingered like a shadow, reminding me that denial had nearly cost me my life. Slowly, though, new routines began to replace old fears. I started writing down my thoughts, journaling every detail I remembered about those years of carrying the lump. At first, it was painful, reliving the shame of ignoring it for so long. But as the pages filled, I began to see something else, a pattern of pride, excuses, and avoidance that nearly killed me. Putting it on paper forced me to confront the man I had been and helped me begin to forgive myself for the choices I had made. One day, a local community center invited me to speak at a health awareness event. I hesitated. Public speaking was never something I enjoyed, but my wife urged me to do it. "If even one person listens and gets help in time, it will be worth it," she said. And so I stood before a small crowd, my hands trembling, my voice unsteady, and told them everything. I told them how I ignored the lump when it was small, how I joked about it while my wife cried in silence, how I let 10 years slip away until it nearly destroyed me. The room was silent. People leaned forward, eyes fixed on me, not because my story was heroic, but because it was terrifyingly human. When I finished, a woman stood and said, "I have something like that on my shoulder. I'm going to see a doctor tomorrow." In that moment, I felt the weight of those 10 years lift, just a little. The months turned into seasons, and I began to feel stronger. My walks grew longer, my appetite returned, and laughter slowly found its way back into our home. Yet every time I caught my reflection, the scar stared back at me. It was crooked and deep, stretching across my scalp like a road map of everything I had endured. Some days I hated it, wishing I could erase it. But most days I touched it gently and whispered a quiet thank you. That scar was my reminder not to waste another day. Still, there were moments when the fear returned. A headache, a sharp pain, even a bump on the skin would send my heart racing, my mind spiraling back into panic. My wife always calmed me, reminding me that vigilance was good but fear could not control us anymore. Together, we learned to live with the scar not as a curse, but as a lesson etched into my body. I began visiting the hospital for regular checkups, not out of fear but out of respect for my second chance. The doctors greeted me with familiarity, some even joking that I had become a legend in their halls. Medical students sometimes asked to meet me, their notebooks ready, their eyes wide with curiosity. I would tell them the truth. Don't let pride kill your patients. Listen to them, but also teach them to listen to themselves. And so life went on. The house felt warmer, the days brighter, the laughter louder. But underneath it all, the memory of those 10 years never left me. It was a shadow that followed me, reminding me each morning as I ran my hand over the scar, I survived. Not by strength, not by wisdom, but by the grace of being given one more chance. And I vowed, with every fiber of my being, that I would never waste that chance again. There came a time when the scar stopped being just a wound and became a part of who I was. At first, I wore hats everywhere I went, ashamed of the stares, of the way people whispered when they saw the long pale line running across my scalp. But eventually, I stopped hiding. I realized that every look I received was not just curiosity. It was a reminder of how far I had come. I no longer wanted to cover up the evidence of my survival. I wanted to carry it openly, as a warning and as a symbol. At family gatherings, people often asked me about those 10 years. Some asked out of concern, others out of morbid fascination. I always answered honestly. I told them about the denial, the excuses, the way I brushed off my wife's pleas, the fear that silently gnawed at me when I was alone. I told them about the night I collapsed from the pain, about the hospital lights glaring down on me, and about the frozen expressions of the surgeons when they opened my head. I watched as their faces changed, the laughter in the room fading into silence, and I knew that my story had weight. It wasn't entertainment, it was a warning carved into my very skin. Life after the surgery was not without struggle. The headaches continued for months, sometimes sharp enough to send me back to bed in the middle of the day. My memory faltered at times, small lapses that frustrated me and made me fear that the mass had left permanent scars inside my mind as well. But the doctors assured me that healing took time, that the body remembered trauma even when the wounds were closed. I tried to believe them, but every stumble, every dizzy spell, reminded me of the years I had ignored my health. My wife became my strength during those moments. She cooked my meals with care, monitored my medicines, and reminded me gently when I forgot things. I began to notice how much older she looked, the lines etched deeper around her eyes, the gray in her hair more pronounced. Those years had aged her too. She hadn't carried the lump physically, but she had carried the burden of fear every day. One evening, as we sat together, I took her hand and said, "I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you sooner." Tears welled in her eyes, and she squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she might never let go. That was when I realized the lump had not only been my battle, it had been ours. Months later, I was invited to speak again, this time at a larger event in the city. I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people, the lights bright, the silence heavy. My hands shook, but my voice grew stronger with each word. I told them how I had ignored my body for 10 years, how I had let pride and denial rule me, and how I had nearly lost everything because of it. I told them about the surgery, about the nurses gasping in shock, about the surgeon's grim face as he cut deeper, about the silence that filled the room when the mass was revealed. I told them that survival was not a miracle but a lesson, and that health should never be taken for granted. When I finished, the audience stood and clapped, but what moved me most were the people who approached me afterward. A woman said she had been hiding a lump on her chest for months and was finally going to see a doctor. A man told me he had ignored chest pains for years but now understood he could not risk waiting. Each confession felt like a small redemption for the years I had wasted. At home, my children grew up watching me live differently. I no longer ignored aches or pains. I went for checkups, I exercised gently, and I tried to treat each day as a gift rather than a guarantee. My son once said, "Dad, you're not the same as before." He was right. The man who had carried a lump for 10 years was gone. In his place was someone who had faced death, stared at the edge, and come back determined to live. But even as I healed, the memories never left me. I could still see the reflection of myself in the mirror years ago, the man with a bulging head and tired eyes who refused to listen. I could still hear the little boy in the cafe asking his mother why that man's head looked so strange. I could still feel the fear in the waiting room as strangers stared, their eyes wide with silent judgment. Those memories stayed with me, not as torment, but as reminders of how far denial can drag a person down. One night, long after I had returned to normal life, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet around me. I touched the scar and whispered to myself, "You survived." I thought of the doctors, the nurses, my wife's tears, my children's fear. I thought of the decade I had wasted pretending nothing was wrong. And I realized that survival was not the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. From that moment on, I dedicated myself to speaking, writing, and sharing my experience. If my scar could save even one person from repeating my mistake, then those 10 years would not have been in vain. And every morning, when the sun rose and I looked at my reflection, I no longer saw just a man who carried a lump for a decade. I saw a man reborn, scarred but alive, humbled but grateful, broken yet whole. I saw a man who had been given a second chance, and who refused to waste it. The seasons changed, and with each passing month I found myself reclaiming pieces of life I had once taken for granted. Walking through the market with my wife became a joy instead of a chore. Hearing my children laugh without the shadow of fear hanging over them filled me with warmth I hadn't felt in years. Yet beneath it all, there was always the memory of the years spent pretending, the weight of the lump I carried like a silent curse, and the haunting image of what the doctors saw when they cut into me. I could never forget how the surgeon described that moment, the room falling into silence, the instruments pausing mid-air, the nurses exchanging terrified looks. He told me later that in his decades of experience, he had never seen a mass quite like mine. Hardened like stone on the outside, but twisted and strange within, as though my body had built a fortress around something it could not destroy. That knowledge lived with me, not to frighten me, but to remind me of how fragile the human body truly is. I tried to turn that fragility into strength. I began to walk daily, even in the rain, even when the wind bit at my scar. The rhythm of my feet on the pavement became a meditation, a promise to myself that I would never again ignore the signals my body sent. My wife often walked beside me, her arm looped through mine, and though she rarely said much, I could feel the relief in her silence. For her, each step I took outside was proof that I was still alive, still moving forward. At home, I grew closer to my children than ever before. My son, once embarrassed to be seen with me, now proudly introduced me to his friends as the father who cheated death. My daughter loved to sit beside me in the evenings, her small hand resting on mine as I told her stories not just about what I had endured, but about the importance of courage and truth. Don't ever hide from what scares you, I told her. Face it, because the longer you wait, the bigger it becomes. She listened with wide eyes, and I prayed that she would carry those words with her long after I was gone. News of my survival continued to spread, and it wasn't long before I was asked to speak again, this time not just in community halls, but at hospitals and universities. Doctors wanted their students to hear directly from me, to see the consequences of denial and the miracle of survival. Standing in front of young faces eager to learn, I told them not just about the medical facts, but about the human cost. I spoke of the nights my wife cried herself to sleep, the fear etched into my children's faces, the humiliation of being stared at in public. I told them that medicine was not just about cutting and stitching, it was about understanding the weight of silence, the damage of pride, the power of compassion. Some students cried as I spoke. Others scribbled furiously in their notebooks. A few came up to me afterward, thanking me, saying they would never forget my words. Each time, I felt my burden lighten. Perhaps those 10 wasted years had a purpose after all. Yet even with purpose, there were moments of darkness. There were nights when the scar itched and burned, when headaches pulsed like old ghosts returning to haunt me. There were days when I looked in the mirror and hated what I saw, the reminder of the man I had been. But in those moments, my wife's steady voice always pulled me back. "You are alive," she whispered. "That is what matters." And she was right. Being alive gave me the chance to change, to make amends, to live differently. I began writing articles, slowly turning my journals into something larger, a collection of lessons, confessions, and warnings. Friends encouraged me to publish them, saying my story could reach people far beyond our city. At first, I resisted. Who would want to read the tale of a foolish man who ignored a lump for 10 years? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my shame could be someone else's salvation. So I kept writing. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I poured everything onto paper: the fear, the denial, the humiliation, the shock, the relief. Each page felt like peeling away another layer of the old me, revealing something raw and honest beneath. Sometimes I wept as I wrote. Sometimes I laughed bitterly at my own stubbornness. But always I wrote with the hope that my words might reach someone before it was too late. Years after the surgery, I visited the hospital again for a follow-up. The same surgeon greeted me with a smile, his eyes warmer now than on that first day. "You've become a legend here," he said. "Every new group of students learns about your case." I chuckled, shaking my head, but deep inside I felt a surge of gratitude. To be remembered not for how I almost died, but for how I survived, that was a gift I never expected. When I left the hospital that day, I stood outside in the sunlight, the city buzzing around me. I touched the scar on my head, felt the rough ridge beneath my fingers, and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. 10 years I had carried a monster, 10 years I had ignored the truth. But I was still here, still breathing, still walking forward. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never again waste a single day of the life I had been given. The years that followed brought a kind of clarity I had never known before. It was as if the surgery had not only removed the mask from my head but had stripped away the illusions I had built around myself. For so long, I had thought of myself as strong because I could endure pain, stubborn because I could tough it out. But I came to realize that ignoring suffering wasn't strength, it was weakness dressed as pride. Real strength was in admitting vulnerability, in listening to my body, in accepting help before it was too late. My days became slower, more intentional. I woke earlier, sometimes before dawn, sitting with a cup of tea by the window while the world was still quiet. I cherished the silence, the chance to reflect, to breathe deeply without the weight of that lump dragging me down. My wife often joined me, her hand resting on mine, and in those moments, I felt closer to her than ever before. We didn't need many words. We had lived through enough silence to know the value of presence alone. The scar, which had once felt like a brand of shame, grew into something I respected. When strangers asked about it, I no longer shied away. I told them openly, because each telling reinforced the lesson I had learned. I became known as the man who survived the lump, a label that once would have embarrassed me but now gave me purpose. At local gatherings, people pulled me aside to show me moles, bumps, or aches they were too afraid to confront. I always told them the same thing. Do not wait. Do not waste years like I did. Some listened immediately. Others smiled nervously, promising to get it checked soon. But I saw the hesitation in their eyes, the same hesitation I had lived with for 10 long years, and I prayed that my scar would remind them not to repeat my mistake. As my children grew, I tried to instill in them what I had learned through suffering. My son once asked me if I regretted those years. I looked at him, at the young man he was becoming, and said, I regret the pain it caused your mother, the fear it gave you. But regret alone cannot change the past. What matters is what we do with the second chances we are given. I wanted him to understand that mistakes, no matter how heavy, could become lessons if carried with honesty. My daughter, more sensitive by nature, would sometimes trace the scar with her fingertips and whisper, I'm glad you're still here, Dad. Those words struck deeper than anything else, reminding me daily that survival wasn't just for myself, it was for them. Opportunities to speak continued to come. I traveled to other towns, sometimes standing in small community centers, other times in large lecture halls, always carrying the same message: fear can kill as surely as any disease. Each time I spoke, I watched faces change before me. Some showed disbelief, others recognition. Many wiped tears from their eyes as I described lying on the operating table, the lights glaring, the surgeons frozen as they uncovered what had lived on me for a decade. When I finished, people often lined up to speak with me. Some thanked me. Others confessed their own fears. A few even booked appointments with doctors the very next day. And each time, I walked away feeling that maybe my suffering had a purpose beyond myself. But in the quiet hours at home, the memories still returned. There were nights when I dreamed I was back in that waiting room. The stares of strangers burning into me, the shame pressing down heavier than the lump itself. Other times I dreamed of the surgery, the scalpel cutting, the silence that followed, the gasps that filled the sterile room. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, my wife soothing me back into the present. Those memories never left me completely, but they reminded me of the line I had walked between life and death. To heal further, I began writing not just for myself, but for others. My journals turned into essays, my essays into a manuscript. With encouragement from friends and doctors, I published a book about my experience. I titled it simply, The Weight I Carried, At first, I worried it was too personal, too raw, but letters began arriving from readers across the country. People wrote to say my story had pushed them to seek help, that my scar had given them courage. Some said it saved their lives. For the first time, I felt that the 10 years of pain, shame, and denial had transformed into something greater, a map for others to avoid the path I had taken. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I tended the garden I had neglected for years, feeling the soil in my hands, the sun on my face. I shared meals with my family, listening more than I spoke, because I understood now that silence had power, but only when it was chosen, not when it was forced by fear. I laughed more freely, cried without shame, and allowed myself to be vulnerable in ways I never had before. Sometimes, when walking through town, people still pointed. The scar drew attention, but instead of shrinking from it, I lifted my head. If they asked, I told them my story. If they whispered, I let them. Because I knew the truth. I had been given a second chance, and every whisper, every stare, every question was another opportunity to remind someone not to waste theirs. And so the man who once lived 10 years under the weight of denial now lived each day as if it were borrowed time, a gift handed back to him after nearly being lost. The scar remained, the memories lingered, but they no longer defined me with fear. They defined me with purpose. I had survived. And survival, I had learned, meant more than breathing. It meant living with gratitude, speaking with honesty, and never again ignoring the voice inside that warns us when something is wrong. The longer I lived with the scar, the more it reshaped not only my life but the way others looked at theirs. It was as though my survival gave people permission to face the things they had been hiding from. Neighbors who had once only nodded politely now stopped me in the street, asking how I was feeling, some even confessing their own secret pains. A woman from down the road told me she had been hiding a lump in her breast for months, too afraid to hear the truth. After hearing my story, she promised to make an appointment the next day. Later, she told me it had saved her life. That one conversation alone made all my years of suffering feel less wasted. My home turned into a place where people came not just to visit, but to talk, to ask questions, to seek advice. Some came with fear in their eyes, desperate for reassurance. Others came with their children, pointing to me as if I was living proof of why one should never ignore what the body is trying to say. I never considered myself wise, but I spoke from my own scars, and somehow, that honesty resonated. People didn't need perfection, they needed truth. At night, I often sat on the porch with my wife, watching the stars emerge above the rooftops. The quiet between us was no longer heavy with unspoken worry but filled with gratitude. She sometimes told me about the years when she had felt utterly alone, begging me to see a doctor, knowing deep down that she was losing me little by little. I listened with shame but also with a renewed vow that I would never again dismiss her fears. My survival wasn't mine alone, it belonged to her, to our children, to everyone who had endured the silent decade beside me. Still, my own inner battles did not disappear overnight. There were mornings when I woke up dizzy, my mind replaying the day of the surgery. The white light burning above me, the surgeon's eyes tightening in shock as he cut deeper. I sometimes wondered what he truly thought when he saw what lay inside my head. He told me it was unusual, something he might never see again, but I could see in his eyes that it had unsettled him. That memory stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death really was. To cope, I immersed myself in writing. The book I had started turned into something larger, a lifeline not just for myself but for others. Letters continued to arrive from strangers, stories of lumps, pains, strange growths they had ignored until my words pushed them to act. Some wrote to thank me for saving their lives. Others simply wrote to say they no longer felt alone. Each letter reminded me that what I once saw as my greatest shame had become a lantern for others lost in the same darkness. My children grew into adults during this time, and I saw in them a cautious wisdom their peers did not yet have. They had lived through my denial, my surgery, my recovery. They had seen firsthand what happens when fear is left unchecked. My son, now older, once said, "Dad, your scar is part of our family's story too." He was right. It wasn't just carved into me, It was etched into all of us. My daughter, ever gentle, often said she wanted to become a nurse after seeing how those in the hospital cared for me. I smiled each time she said it, silently grateful that my suffering had inspired her toward compassion instead of fear. The hospital remained a place I returned to regularly for checkups. Each time I walked through its halls, I felt the echoes of my past, my body on the gurney, the cold machine scanning my head, the hushed whispers of nurses outside my door. But instead of trembling with dread, I walked with a strange pride. The doctors greeted me warmly, some calling me by name, others simply smiling knowingly. I was no longer just a patient. I had become a story they told, a reminder they gave to new students about why medicine was more than science. Life outside the hospital flourished in ways I never expected. I tended the garden with care, planting flowers and vegetables as though each seed was another chance at life. I took long walks through the town, nodding to those who recognized me, breathing deeply the air I once thought I might never taste again. I laughed more with my wife, held her hand tighter, never letting a day pass without telling her I loved her. The man I had been before, the one who ignored, denied, and shrugged away responsibility, was gone. In his place was someone reborn through suffering. But the scar, though healed, never let me forget. It tugged when the weather changed, a dull ache when the air grew damp. It burned when I grew too tired, a reminder to slow down, to respect the body that had fought so long to keep me alive. Each time I touched it, I remembered the decade I had wasted, and I vowed never again to let fear dictate my choices. One day, years after the surgery, I stood before a large audience at a medical conference. Doctors, students, nurses, all gathered to hear my story. As I spoke, I looked into their eyes and saw not just curiosity but empathy. They weren't listening to a medical case. They were listening to a man who had lived it. I told them everything: the denial, the shame, the laughter of strangers, the frozen silence in the operating room, the tears of my wife, the fear of my children. When I finished, the room rose to its feet. The applause was not just for me, it was for survival itself. As I walked off the stage, I felt lighter. For the first time, I truly believed that those 10 years, though filled with pain, had not been wasted. They had become something more, a bridge between my suffering and the lives of those I could still reach. Now, each morning when I wake, I no longer ask myself why this happened. I no longer curse the wasted years. Instead, I place my hand on my scar and whisper the same words I have carried since the day I left the hospital: you survived. Do not waste it. And so I live, not as the man who ignored his pain, but as the man who endured it, faced it, and rose from it, carrying the lesson carved forever into his skin. Time became my teacher in ways no doctor ever could. The more distance I gained from that surgery, the more I understood that survival was not just about what happened on the operating table. It was about what I chose to do with the days afterward. At first, I thought healing would be a matter of weeks, perhaps months. But as the years passed, I realized that healing was not measured by stitches dissolving or scars fading. Healing was the process of learning to live differently, to value each day as if it were a fragile flame that could flicker out without warning. I learned to slow down. For a man who once rushed through life, shrugging off pain, ignoring his family's pleas, this was a revelation. I began to notice things I had never truly seen before: the way my wife hummed softly when she cooked, the sparkle in my daughter's eyes when she laughed, the quiet determination in my son's shoulders as he grew into a man. These details had always been there, but in the shadow of the lump, I had missed them. Now I drank them in as though they were treasures. There were still challenges. My health was never the same. I tired easily, and sometimes my head throbbed with phantom pains. There were moments when panic surged through me, convinced another lump might be growing, hidden beneath the skin, waiting to destroy me again. Each ache, each dizziness sent me back into that operating room in my mind. But instead of letting fear control me, I learned to act. I went to the doctor, I spoke up, I asked questions. I never again allowed silence to endanger me. That change, more than the surgery itself, was my true survival. As word of my story spread, people I had never met began to write letters. Some shared their gratitude, telling me that my journey gave them the courage to face their own fears. Others told me about the things they had hidden from their families, the lumps, the coughs, the pains, and how they finally sought help. Reading their words brought me both joy and sorrow. Joy, because my suffering had meaning. Sorrow, because I knew how many others still suffered in silence, trapped in the same cycle of denial that nearly killed me. The book I published found its way into more hands than I ever imagined. A teacher wrote to say she read passages aloud to her students, teaching them about responsibility and listening to their bodies. A doctor told me he used my story as a case study for medical students, not just for the science, but for the human lesson it carried. Even strangers stopped me in the street, thanking me for sharing, some with tears in their eyes. Each encounter reminded me that the scar I carried was no longer just mine, it belonged to everyone who saw it and chose to change because of it. My wife remained my constant companion, but our relationship deepened in ways I could not have foreseen. We no longer argued about small things. We no longer wasted hours on trivial frustrations. We had looked death in the eye together, and everything else seemed unimportant in comparison. Sometimes we sat together in silence, and it was enough. Other times we laughed until our sides ached, grateful for the sound of joy in our home. She told me once, her voice breaking, "When I thought I would lose you, I realized that nothing else mattered, not the bills, not the gossip, not the worries. Just you." Those words cut deep, because I knew how close I had come to robbing her of the life we were meant to share. My children carried the story into their own lives. My son, now older, took better care of himself, perhaps more cautious than his friends, but I saw it as wisdom earned through fear. My daughter followed her dream of working in healthcare, inspired by the nurses who had cared for me when I was too weak to care for myself. She told me once, "Dad, I want to be the kind of person who sits by someone's bed and makes them feel they're not alone, the way those nurses did for you." Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. If my suffering planted even one seed of compassion in her, then perhaps it had not been wasted. Still, the scar never let me forget. On rainy days it ached. On sleepless nights, it itched as if the wound were new again. Sometimes, standing in front of the mirror, I saw not just the man who survived but the ghost of the man who almost didn't. I spoke to that reflection often, as though reminding myself out loud, "You are alive. Do not waste it." Those words became my mantra, the anchor that held me steady when the waves of memory threatened to drag me under. Years later, I was invited to give a lecture at a major medical conference. I stood on a stage, hundreds of doctors and students watching, lights hot on my face. I told my story in full, the 10 years of denial, the humiliation in public, the fear of my wife, the frozen silence in the operating room, the tears of survival. As I spoke, I saw faces soften, eyes shine, hands grip notebooks tighter. And when I finished, the applause rolled over me like thunder. But more than the applause, it was the quiet conversations afterward that stayed with me. A young doctor approached and said, "Your story will make me a better physician. I'll remember to see not just the illness, but the person living with it." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of how far I had come, from a man who hid behind pride and silence, to a man whose scar had become a lesson for strangers. I realized then that life had given me more than a second chance. It had given me purpose. And so I continued to live with gratitude carved into every breath, with humility stitched into every step. I am not the man I was before the lump. I am not the man I was when I ignored it. I am the man who carries a scar, not as a burden, but as a testament, a story written in flesh, warning and guiding anyone willing to listen. And each morning, when I rise and place my hand on that scar, I whisper the same words that have carried me through the years: "You survived. Live like it matters." The years rolled on, and the scar on my head softened with time, though it never disappeared. It became part of me, a mark that drew questions but also carried answers. Whenever someone asked about it, I didn't hesitate anymore. I told them everything: the 10 years of ignoring it, the shame, the fear, the surgery, the silence in the operating room. Each telling was a release, and each person who listened carried away a piece of the lesson that silence and pride can be as dangerous as any illness. Life after survival was not perfect, but it was fuller. I cherished the mornings with my wife, the evenings with my children, the laughter that once felt so distant now filling our home like sunlight through open windows. Even small things, a warm meal, a quiet walk, a shared smile, took on a weight I had never appreciated before. I lived slower, but I lived deeper. The book I wrote reached more people than I ever imagined. Letters continued to arrive, some from strangers who thanked me, others from families who had lost loved ones and found comfort in my words. My scar had become more than my own burden, it had become a symbol for others, a reminder to act before it was too late. One evening, long after my children had grown and left home, I sat with my wife on the porch. The air was cool, the sky painted with fading streaks of orange. She looked at me, her eyes gentle but firm, and said, "You gave us years we might never have had. That scar saved you, but it saved all of us too." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had thought of the lump only as a curse. Now I realized it had also been a gift, a brutal, unforgiving teacher that had forced me to change, to see what truly mattered. As night fell, I touched the scar once more. It no longer burned or itched. It no longer filled me with shame. It was quiet, like an old friend who had finished telling his story. I whispered the words that had guided me through every day since the surgery: "You survived. Do not waste it." And I didn't. I lived the rest of my days with gratitude, with love, with honesty. I was no longer the man who ignored the truth. I was the man who faced it, endured it, and came through carrying a scar that spoke louder than any words ever could. That was my story, the weight I carried, the lesson I learned, and the life I chose to live after nearly losing it all.